The characteristics of fascism. Terrorism. Terrorism and political violence were directly related and inherent to the ideology of fascism. The Oxford Dictionary defines terrorism as, quote, the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims, unquote. One problem with this definition is the term unlawful. By using this single word, it inherently removes governments from being terrorist actors. Political science professor Cindy C. Combs notes this issue very directly in her book, Terrorism in the 21st Century. In that book, Combs notes how, quote, terrorism is a political term derived from state terror, unquote. Due to this astute observation, Combs offers her own definition of the term. Terrorism is, quote, a synthesis of war and theater, a dramatization of the most proscribed kind of violence, that which is perpetrated on innocent victims, played before an audience in the hope of creating a mood of fear for political purposes, unquote. For the purposes of these videos, this definition is a better working definition. The fascists utilized terrorism both when they were attempting to gain power as well as when they actually seized that power. Terror defines the totalitarian state. For both the Italian fascists and the German Nazis, terrorism was a key part of their early rise to power. Both the black shirts and the brown shirts bloodied their opponents in bloody, public, and spectacular fashions. There were so many of these kind of actions that it would be difficult to catalog all of them. Further, such a cataloging is outside of the purview of these videos. Let it suffice to look at a few examples. In one typical example, on a February night in 1927, the Nazis and the Communists attacked one another in the streets of Berlin. The Nazis themselves recorded what happened during this altercation. Quote, within seconds, both sides had picked up chairs, beer mugs, even tables, and a savage fight began. The Communists were gradually pushed under the gallery, which we had taken care to occupy, and soon chairs and glasses came hurtling down from there also. The fight was quickly decided. The KPD left with 85 wounded or more or less. That is to say, they could not get down the stairs as fast as they had calmly and innocently climbed them. On our side, we counted 3 badly wounded and about 10 to 12 slightly. When the police appeared, the fight was already over. Marxist terrorism had been bloodily suppressed, unquote. Hundreds of other such altercations occurred throughout the era of the Weimar Republic. Figures of exactly how many people were killed and injured in such terrorist violence is hard to find. Statistician Ernst Julius Gumbel estimated that between 1918 and 1922, some 376 people were murdered. The vast majority were murdered by the Nazis and other nationalist groups. Other figures paint a far starker and more violent picture. One estimate states that during one vicious riot that lasted 9 days in 1919, 15,000 Germans died in Berlin, with another 12,000 wounded. Violence plagued and largely defined the Weimar Republic. Because of this, German paramilitary organizations like the SA became immensely popular. Throughout the 1920s, at least 1.5 million young German men joined such organizations. Similarly, the Italian blackshirts engaged in terroristic violence against opposition trade unions and Marxist or socialist groups. Hundreds were killed and injured by fascist terrorists. The Japanese militarists likewise assassinated several government officials before they took full control of the island nation. After the fascists seized power, their terroristic violence did not cease. Rather, it was shifted to being state terrorism. The secret police forces of the regimes, the Gestapo, the Kempeitai, routinely silenced all opposition through torture and murder. The Nazi SS and Einsatzgruppen facilitated Nazi genocide, murdering millions. The Japanese Imperial Army harshly punished any colonial peoples that stood against them. Their indiscriminate violence is well remembered in the rape of Nanking. Now, this being said, the fascists were not alone in using this kind of violence. In the same time period that the Nazis were forming the SA, their communist rivals formed the Alliance of Red Front Fighters. One of their slogans was, quote, "Beat the fascists wherever you encounter them," unquote. Horst Wessel, as was discussed in an earlier video, was murdered by one of these communist groups and thus became a martyr to the Nazi cause. Even outside of the context of the 1920s through the 30s, it can scarcely be said that terrorism was inherently or specific to fascism. Examples of communist terrorist organizations abound. There was the Red Army faction, the Sandinistas, the Viet Cong, the FARC, the Weather Underground, the Shining Path, etc. Further, terrorism does not necessarily need to be ideological. History is replete with examples of states and empires engaging in terroristic violence against rivals and potential rivals. The examples are too numerous to even list here. It may deserve a book of its own to fully explore the topic. So this being said, even though terrorism is not specific to fascism itself, it is nevertheless an important characteristic of fascism.